Mike is knowledgeable on the Allegheny division of the Erie and I guess EL. And that's pretty much what his presentation is going to revolve around. It's kind of nice to see a West End presentation at one of these meetings. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having us and allowing me to be had. And thank you for attending, those who are on board. I appreciate that. I would also like to point out that it's helpful if everybody is muted except me. So hopefully I won't be disturbed by sounds that aren't occurring here in my house.
Just to add to what, before Mike starts, I forgot to mention, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat window. And at the end of the presentation, I will go through them and I'll read them off to Mike so he can answer them.
Thank you, Paul.
Sorry about that.
No, not a problem. I guess I have to admit to being somewhat of a child of Erie, as I was born in Olean, and no one immediately in my family worked for the railroad. However, I have an uncle somewhere deep, I think probably a great uncle on my father's side, who was a dispatcher at Salamanca, and I have a great something or other grandfather on my mother's side that helped build the Erie through the southern tier. But I didn't work for the railroad. I just lived near it. So I suppose I was my own victim of nurturing so close to the railroad. I do have a vivid recollection of the Centennial train being on display in Olean, which had to be 1951 when I was just past 4 years old. And the thing I really remember about that was how hot it was inside those F7s. Anyway, I've had this slide up for a little bit here. I think we can probably dispense with it. Location is going to be pretty much the Allegheny County, a little bit of Cattaraugus County, and sometimes a trip elsewhere on the railroad. Let's see. Yeah, my love of the Erie probably does show with this, but I don't mean to leave out the Lackawanna. It certainly was a lovely railroad, and all of them are certainly missed. Oh, let's see now. Why isn't? Oh, well, now we're stuck. Do you think we could make do with just this slide? I can't seem to make it go. Oh, let's try this one. Oh, I'm sorry for this. There's mysteries about this world that just don't seem to have solutions. But we can get.
So your cursor moving.
Yeah, finally, it's very uncooperative. There we go. I dedicate all my programs to Bill Reddy. He was really a wonderful man. He shared so many things, railroad and otherwise, with not only me, but lots of people. He had a lot of interests, and he was certainly a wonderful man to have known. Thanks to quite a few people there. The little yellow diamonds are people that did work for the Erie or Erie Lackawanna that were helpful along the way. I should say that my relationship to the Erie was very much a part of my childhood, particularly my mid-teens. And some of the best photographs that I have were taken when I was 15 and 16. So this is fun. The talk handout that I've used in the past, which I think dates from 2007, was used for the basis of this central article here in the Diamond. And I had participation in the other two articles there, all of which deal with the Allegheny division. And to help those that maybe live in other places, this is a map from, I think, the late 30s, because we don't go to Mount Morris anymore on this map, but helps you to see where we are. We're basically west of Hornell and in east of Salamanca here with this. So here's a little better view of that. And the interesting thing about the Allegheny division was the way it was operated. And the old main line, which you see here in the lower right, is the original path of the 1850s construction, and which, by the way, was completed at Cuba in 1851. And that was operated in our time frame as a absolute permissive block system, block signals and manually controlled sidings, telephone order, timetable and train order operation. And the river line, which figures prominently in my talk, was CTC, controlled initially from Salamanca, but early in the Erie Lackawanna era was moved to Youngstown. And then west of Cuba Junction, it was a double track block signal. So the old main line over the hill through Wellsville, Friendship, and Belmont, that was a single track. And the river line was single track with controlled sidings. And west of Cuba Junction to Salamanca, double track. And let's see. I've conceived of a model railroad concept that would feature Cuba Junction as a central part of it. I'm not sure I'll ever do this, but it would be fun to have something that would have CB Junction in the middle, X Tower perhaps on the west, and the two branches that go to the east. The trains that I saw in those 50s and 60s era were the 6 passenger trains, 1, 2, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We occasionally had other extra passenger trains. 6 days a week out of Salamanca would come 96, and out of Hornell would come 95 as the local way freights. And these two trains would meet at Wellsville. The locomotives would continue on to the destinations they were headed for, and the crews would return to the places where they started. So this was the operation of the way freight until I was going to look up the date that they closed the station in Belmont. I think it was in spring of '64. And by that time, the less than carload freight activity on the Erie, Lackawanna, and everybody else was over. And it was that kept some of these little town type stations open, including my hometown of Belmont. So the way freight's operating that LCL service was a good part of what that train was all about. And when that went away, the way freight was then tied up at Wellsville, and it worked a little east of Wellsville and west of Wellsville, but Salamanca was never the same after that. That was really a death knell for Salamanca, in my estimation. Through freights occasionally came over the main line, but normally they would be routed on the river line, where they could be controlled through those sidings when there were meets. Light engines and this balancing of power, which was an Erie thing and Erie Lackawanna thing, where you'd see about 2 or 3 times the locomotives on the head of westbound freights, or maybe just the locomotives with a caboose heading west to balance power. That was a weekly thing almost in my observation of life there. And of course, we had the work extras and weed spraying and the Sperry Rail activity. What we're going to see initially is a little taste of all or most of these trains, and we'll talk about it. But I thought this was an interesting way to get started with photographs. Richard Gardner was I believe he was a passenger representative for much of his career at Salamanca, and his widow gave me this picture. And interestingly, along with this, after I got it, Denny Mead found a newspaper article talking about these Lackawanna units working east on the head of Erie freight trains. So here we are in 1945 with a little taste of what's to come in 15 years. And this was part of my boyhood experience here. I like to say some of my best photographs occurred with the return of Phoebe. So this was a wonderful thing to see firsthand happen. And it was fun to ride that train when I could, which was all too seldom. Well, here's Phoebe approaching Cuba Junction in its first month of return. And what they would do is about 7 o'clock in the evening, they'd be coming off the hill east of Cuba, which is largely a 1% grade. And they'd be hitting the brakes to go through the crossover at Cuba Junction, which is just ahead of this scene, which is now 3 years later. And this would be the typical view as they went through the junction with the brake smoke pouring out and the beautiful tavern lounge showing. And I realized in preparing this a little bit ago that it was only 40 months that we had the delight of Phoebe running on our favorite railroad. Here's the eastbound counterpart at the same location. They had to slow to 30 miles an hour to go west, but this guy's coming around this, I think it's a 1.5 degree curve. They had to slow to 60 to come through this. And that's also with a facing point switch for the crossover to the river line on super elevated curve. So that was kind of an interesting situation. Here we are at Belmont with the eastbound, and the Genesee River is alongside there. This is a site of frequent or repetitive washouts every few years. And you see the riprap involved in restoring this. What you see there in 1964 was placed, I think, in 1960, when the river had washed out right over to where the train sits, and the ends of the ties were out over the water. It was that close to breaking through and collapsing the track. The tree, which I hope, yeah, that tree right there was a favorite place for me to perch to take a picture like this. Another day and another view of that washout. And here I am. I rarely got on the other side of the river, but for some reason I did here. By of course, October of '66, we knew the time was running out for this lovely train. So I rode it whenever I could. Here's a view at Hornell with a Lackawanna coach, which was frequently the coaches you would see on the Phoebe in those days. And here they are departing Hornell at the very end. This isn't the last day. I think this was Friday. The last train was the next day, Saturday. I have these little yellow stickies on the screen to remind me to say something about things. And I had 3.5 years earlier than this photographed the yard, which I think was 9 tracks for that LCL traffic that was very much a part of Hornell. That platform and several more like it over there to the left was where all these 40-foot boxcars would be staged and loaded with things to go in all places, all over the railroads. And that was that LCL traffic. Here we are at Wellsville, and when we got so close to the train departing, I consulted with my friends at RIT that were in the photography school about how I could take a halfway decent picture at night, and this was one of the better ones. Well, we had other trains. Here's number 7, the Pacific Express at Belmont. It's right alongside the siding that Belmont had, and to the right is the old what they called PE switch. And PE switch was a team track for unloading that lime that was used on the farmers' fields. We had 2 different pockets, or actually not so much pockets, but places where coal could be loaded into a fenced off staging area, plus boxcars with lumber and other team track type traffic would be handled there. This train has the container on flat car here by late 1964, but earlier than that, you'll see shortly, there were trailers. Here's number 7 again at my washout site, and I'm again in the tree. As I recall, I was this was just before my Regents tests in New York State. If you're familiar with that as a student, we would take Regents tests. Well, I was studying, I think, physics and maybe one of them mathematics as I waited for the train. And so here comes number 7, and there it goes. Still carrying mail in those days, and that was always a fun part of the train. And what was absolutely blew me away that day, right on the heels of 7 came the M&E special. There were a number of occasions where you would have what appeared to be a second section on both 7 and 8, where the traffic was so heavy that Erie Lackawanna ran almost another sort of 7 or 8 train. I mean, it looked the same, except it didn't have a mail car here. And here's number 8, back at the west end of the siding at Belmont, and you can see we've got trailers on the on 7 there. We've got a PA probably being shuttled for service to Hornell. And here's number 8, departing Cuba Junction. Again, this train would have rounded the bend about 60 miles an hour, heading up the grade, and would have been preparing to stop at the Cuba station in those days. And I've always was amused that in spite of having electric service on coaches and cabooses, we would still see oil burning marker lamps, which what you have here. You'll see that on a couple more examples. And in the fall, out of Youngstown would run a fall foliage special. They would come out of Youngstown with about a dozen Stillwell coaches and maybe a baggage car for snack and souvenir sales. And they would go by way of Cuba Junction to the river line. So you'd cross the 2 large bridges on the river line at Belfast and Rush Creek, and then swing north on the Y at River Junction, cross the incredibly spectacular bridge at the Letchworth Falls, go up to Silver Springs, run around the train, head back the other way to Hornell, run around the train again, and come back by way of the old main line. So that was a real treat to ride that train. I got to do it once, but 2 years later, I only got to photograph it here. Well, we spoke of 95. 95 by 1964 is now working out of Wellsville. So it's heading west and got out of Wellsville in time to pull into the first siding at Belmont to meet number 2. Trainman's going ahead to open the derail, which is just beside his head there. And then up by the signal will be the switch. Once number 2 is cleared, they'll pull out of town. Here they are on another day at Cuba Junction. And we'll talk about the Jeep 7s later, but this is one of the 4 that had no dynamic brake or winterization hatch, and an unusually large number of cars to have been gathered at Wellsville. Another day in 64, returning from probably Olean. They did not at that time go to Salamanca anymore, so they're coming back, having gone over to Olean, switched the interchange with the Pensy and headed east. And surprise, they had an Alco B unit here. And near as I can tell, this was one of the victims that crashed in Ravenna, Ohio, the previous fall, almost in the lap of Larry DeYoung's home. And Larry's father, I believe, took photographs of the wreck. And I think this is one of the units that was involved. You can't see it in this picture or the other one that I took of the other end of the B unit, but the whole end is almost missing. It's like torn away. So I figured it took that long for some reason to get it wheel worthy to go to Hornell to be repaired. I can't talk about the way freight without mentioning the WAG. the Wellsville, Edison, Gailton connected with the Erie Lackawanna at Wellsville. And they were at various times a busy short line. And the most visible sign of that would be sometimes you'd see countless numbers of these former Boston and Maine single sheet boxcars. And this particular group of 5 have just been refurbished in 1966. And they're on their way out as roaming XM1 or XM boxcars to be used for any load that anybody wants to put in. The other interesting boxcar they had were 4 of these, and I photographed this in '63. Very intriguing car because it has the Salzburg colors, which you can't appreciate in this picture, but here's the class car of the 4 at Gailton, and in fact, being used for LCL service at their freight house here. And these would be loaded with merchandise, packages, small shipments that wouldn't fill a single boxcar. And they would be delivered often to the Erie Lackawanna there in Wellsville. And you would see them heading west or coming back in the way freight. So this was a fascinating car. The B&M car is beside it, but these cars, these 4 came from the Rock Island a year ahead of the B&M. Activity at Wellsville always involved gondolas and flat cars. The 2 big manufacturing companies there both shipped large things, and you'll see a couple here shortly. So gondolas were always in need there at Wellsville. Here they're getting ready to leave Wellsville at the end of one of those sidings, and I might point out that this absolute permissive block signal has no number board, so it's an absolute stop. If it's red, you can't go. It's hard to tell, but it's a green signal here. He's good to leave town. Benny Lyons is at the throttle, and he's going to pull out of here shortly. And you can see the packaged flat car load is one of those things that we talked about. Here's the other end of that same train. It's full of air preheater products. And one of those industries is the Worthington industry to the right. Here we are west of Cuba Junction, and this is kind of a typical number 95, although probably a little shy of cars for what I typically remember. The trains were a pretty good length. That boxcar ahead of the caboose is one of those 1930 or so vintage cars that were assigned to salt service. The Erie had a few of those identified. Back at the Belmont passing siding, 96 on this day in 62 has come from Salamanca, and it's a kind of a overcast day. They're in the siding, they're waiting for train 7 to come out of Wellsville. And again, the absolute stop signal there is showing green because 7 has not departed Wellsville yet, but it's about time that it did. This train also illustrates a lot of the traffic that the Erie Lackawanna brought to the WAG. I'm quite sure that that Milwaukee car is in Hyde service. The WAG directly and indirectly served 3 rather significant tanneries, and Hyde cars were frequent part of the traffic on the way freight. The typical big freight, we called them, was powered by Alcos, as you see here at Meadville in 1949. This was the power throughout the 50s and into the early 60s of the Erie Lackawanna era. These Alcos were assigned to that part of the railroad, and it was typical to see a match set of 4. In this case, it's 730 A, B, C, and D. They're pulling this train. Here's one in 64, which I photographed. Now, by this time, they were mixing them up, but they typically, prior to this, would have matched sets. This one is not matched, but it's all Alco and kind of typical for what had been the early years there. This is Cuba Junction, the end of the river line. and the siding in the foreground is the siding, the 165 car siding at Cuba Junction. Off to the right there, you see an old remnant of the water stand that would have served the 3300s when they needed a drink. Same location, a little bit to the east. The tool house is to the left. There was one of these concrete tool house that was typical. The Erie, we used concrete a lot for that, although that one disappeared shortly after Conrail. But here we have a westbound, again, it's all Alco in 1963. And that happens to be me here in the foreground, and my brother took this picture. I like to make a note that off to the left of the photograph, that valley that you see in the distance is where the first petroleum deposits in North America were found. I think in, 1627 is the date. And you could still go there and see the markers for that kind of thing. Kind of neat thing to have on the railroad. Here we are at Belmont along that Genesee River. We're a little bit west of the washout. The river is off to the right. And I don't know what, this is one of these pictures that I apologized for in that lead slide. I don't know what's going on there, but I need a good editor for some of these things. Maybe someday we can improve on this. But this is PB1 coming over the Old Main Line. They're running, I think at this point, probably just behind train 8. And the dispatchers would have to weave these through freights in between the existing passenger trains that were still around. Here we are at Cuba Junction, and I mentioned the crossover there on the 60-mile-an-hour curve. He's entered that crossover to go down the river line with a new Alco and 2 old ones, and the little ramblers that were shipped out of Bain, Wisconsin on trailers. And there you can see the rear end. That was always exciting to see the Auto 100. That's an operator there named Ned Gayford. He was temporarily at this site because earlier in the day, the eastbound track had been closed for surfacing work. And same location, we're on the east side of Cuba Junction. This, I think, was my first encounter with U-25s. And going, in this case, on a Sunday afternoon, they're running up the hill ahead of train 8. I know this was earlier in the afternoon, so they had to scoot along to stay ahead of train 8 by the time they get to Hornell. Let's see here. Oh, here's the rear of that train. And we had a water plug on the Old Main Line, you can see there. And by this time, we were seeing more of Lackawanna cabooses. They were kind of unusual to find. So much of the old Erie, particularly west of Hornell, seemed to be, in my mind, particularly in recollection, operated pretty much like it was still the Erie. So the cabooses, the locomotives, and practices were not yet affected by the merger. I think it was really the 1963 and the arrival of Mr. White that started to change a lot of that. Here we are in 1967 at Cuba. The depot is right there peaking above the tree line. And we have a 100, a piggyback 100 racing to the east in this cut. And neat thing, this was the last part of the Erie to be built in 1851. And apparently the excavation of this cut and the fills that were needed above this to the east were some of the things that slowed down the completion of the railroad. Another little detail of this cut, it shared the track to the right with the Bradford, Eldred, and Cuba narrow gauge. Which came in from due south of this location. Well, in 1965, we really started to see the locomotives get mixed up. And this is a good example of it. We have a little bit of everything in this particular train. And that seemed to be the case with the older power. It's like they threw everything into a one big deck, shuffled it, and then sent everything west. And the reason for that had to do with automatic train stop, which we'll touch on here in a little bit. Here's another case of what we would see. The new centuries would be hooked up with the older power. In this case, 2 Erie Alcos, but that's a Lackawanna Jeep 7 in the back there. And when I prepared this program a while ago, I realized, gee, there's something odd back there behind the locomotive. And so I blew this up a little and asked the question, what is that thing? And I realized the same time I was preparing this, shortly after, I at a train show where John Gruber or Mike Gruber showed up, he had this picture. And you can see clearly that this is the same as that car. And I hadn't really paid a whole lot of attention, but then I checked my notes, and sure enough, I had, as a kid, I'd write down locomotive numbers, car numbers. I had 3 numbers of these 25 that were these converted boxcars. And this kind of introduces another thing about the Erie Lackawanna in its early years. So much of this kind of equipment was spun off by 1963. 40-foot boxcars, odd things like this. This guy, 25, these 25 were sold to the Pensy, and they operated on Pensy for several years. And the 40-foot boxcars, they simply had no need for so many once the LCL work disappeared. Here's Croxton 99 coming off the hill. This was often the case. You'd see, particularly with the piggyback cars, only 58, but you know that's like over 100 cars of 40-foot cars. I note the ballast difference here. The eastbound track is limestone, freshly laid that summer, and the westbound track has still got a lot of the old iron furnace slag ballast that the Erie favored. And again, we see a mix of power. This guy would have been an east of Hornell F unit prior to this time frame. Here's Ned Gayford again. He's handing up a clearance card to the PB1 here, and all EMD F units, which were not the normal thing we would see prior to these to this kind of time frame, 1963-64. Here's another interesting train. This thing was 156 cars and had come out of Hornell, and I think I understood hearing about it that they stopped at every place from there to Belfast to set out or deal with a crippled car. If it was seriously crippled, they'd set it out. Otherwise, they'd have to fix it. So here they are approaching Cuba Junction on a day that eastbound track is closed. So there's only a single track between Cuba Junction and Olean. And they let this guy go. And he ended up holding up 3 trains behind him and a couple of eastbounds west of Hornell or Olean, because he blew an air hose before he got to Olean. So this was quite an interesting morning. And here is what they called an ordinary. It's just a mixed freight. This was Memorial Day weekend when I was a junior in high school. Again, a Lackawanna Jeep. They could MU with the Erie and Lackawanna bigger or more typical road power. We'll talk about that shortly. Here's the same train heading down the river line on a Sunday morning. Oh, I might point out there's one of the practices they did with they'd have the oil markers, but you'll see there in the railing, a red lantern was always there. We'll see that in a couple more cabooses. Here was another ordinary later in the decade. This was a long, slow freight, but 3,000 horsepower was what they hooked up to pull it. And you can see it. This is again a time of more new ballast on that eastbound train. Here's another Lackawanna caboose on a cold day in December. And when I mentioned light engines, here is two Erie Jeeps that were, for some reason, they'd run up to Wellsville and back. I can only guess to do some switching because they went up with nothing and they came back with nothing. A very puzzling thing I never did understand. Here's a work train spreading ballast out there on that eastbound main. My first encounter with a former Lackawanna S2. I had two of my little brothers with me. Imagine doing this today. Here I am, a teenager, and I take two kids that are about 10 or 8 years old with me. We get dropped off at the junction. We spend the day there. The crew invites all three of us to ride in the locomotive for a while. And then they said, well, why don't you go back in the caboose, ride back there? And they're spreading ballast there with the tie across the rails. And they got a chain just metering out stone to lay the ballast. And we occasionally had weed sprayers from Nalco. Rear of the train would be pushed with, in the cases I photographed, it was always an RS3, I suspect from out around Marion. We're going to look at locomotives. This goes to one of those things about the Erie and early Erie Lackawanna. The assigned Erie locomotives tended to be kept where they were assigned in the Erie days once the Lackawanna merger occurred. Of course, the E8s were the dominant passenger power, but we would see PAs. The 1200 series Jeep 7s were the normal power on the way freights. And that was from 1952 until the early 60s was the five that were assigned in 1952 were the same ones there 10 and 12 years later doing the same function. We would see the Baldwin 1150 series because they were kept in Salamanca for the coal trains coming up from Brockway. And they would occasionally have to fill in for the Jeeps on the way freight. The Alco locomotives, like you've seen already, were always the freight power, the big freight power, except occasionally we would see the 800s that were out at Marion. And I mentioned the automatic train stop and the change that occurred in the either late 63 or early 64 timeframe. But automatic train stop was a way of life east of Hornell on the two divisions, Susquehanna and Delaware. And they kept the equipment that was equipped for that there. So you would not normally see FTs, F7s, or F3s west of Hornell, other than those F3s that were out at Marion that had been passenger locomotives. We'll talk about that shortly. And second generation of power, of course, first appeared in 1963, and within another year and a couple of months, we had a whole bunch more. I mentioned the assignments. Thanks to Ben Anthony, who was a General Electric engineer and quite a knowledgeable guy on signaling and railroad practices, he came up with this chart. And I don't know if he made it or he made a copy of one that was on the railroad, but this thing dates from the mid-50s, prior to the arrival of the Jeep 9s. And you see for the Allegheny, the Allegheny Meadville division, you see down there circled 8 MFSB 15Bs. Those are the Baldwin 6-axle locomotives. And there's 5 MFSE 15s. Those are 1228 to 1232. The locomotives that were assigned out of Hornell to be the way freight locomotives. Those were the 1200s that I almost constantly saw on the head of the local. And the EMD F units, you see, they're all Delaware and Susquehanna division because they're equipped with automatic train stop. And the PE-15s, the former 800 series F3s that were initially passenger power before the E8s, they're assigned to Marion, and they're working between Marion and Chicago typically, although they would sometimes get away and come east. And you see, you've got PAs out there at Marion as well. You've got PAs on the Mahoning division because they're needed out of Cleveland. And you also have them on the New York division for some of the passenger or commuter trains. The other thing to note is SB12 over here on the right-hand side, those are the two Baldwin switchers that were assigned to Salamanca. Oh, this cursor is so slow. Two of them there. They were the very first Baldwin S12s, and the Erie assigned them to Salamanca. Anyway, we can say a few things about the E units, 25 of them, all delivered in 1951. And of course, I think you guys know the assignment of the numbers with the Erie Lackawanna. Only one changed. The differences between the E units for the two railroads, horns, steam boiler arrangement was somehow different on the Lackawanna from the Erie. Headlights were different. And the Erie added a sand filler on each side behind the cab door. Why that happened would be an interesting thing to pursue. All of them came with the automatic train stop. And the way the Lackawanna units were handled prior to 1960, when they were running from Binghamton to just east of Corning, is unknown. At least I don't know, and I haven't found anybody that can talk about it with any knowledge. Of course, painting and lettering and windows changed over the ages, particularly later in life. And of course, many of them were re-geared for freight service. Well, here we are in 1952. This is near Hinsdale, New York, which is the first town east of Olean. And it's train 8. And you can see here already the pilot shrouding, which was on the delivered locomotives. They have found that this is a maintenance issue that they don't want to have to deal with. And I'll point out, since we got a good view of it here, behind this porthole, it's blank. But watch that spot. Here, it now has a sand box filler door. For some reason, the Erie added these things. Skirting around the fuel tank is gone. Good view of the automatic train stop sensor here. And this is pre-merger. We don't have any ladder up the nose, but that comes later. Here's the automatic train stop pickup. And when that thing rides over this guy mounted on the ground, this guy knows that the signal is red and somehow is energized. That transmits to the pickup on the locomotive and informs the engineer that he just ran a red light. But this, as I said earlier, and note here in my sticky, this was done away with either in late 63 or sometime in 64. And of course, this system dates back decades. It was on all the steam locomotives that worked here on these divisions. And it also set up the idea that assigning the locomotives to these divisions was part of how they handled the assignments of the locomotives. And so not everything would be equipped with those pickups. Here we are early in the merger. These guys didn't last long with this arrangement. I photographed a couple that way in probably 62, but I suspect by 63, they were all repainted. And here we are later in the decade, and you see the second unit's missing portholes, and lettering is different, as some of you have, I know, closely studied. This is X Tower at Olean. And this is now number 3. Train 7 has been eliminated, but they continue to run on timetable trains 3 and 4 in place of 7 and 8 respectively, to handle the express business they still had. And I've always been intrigued with this photograph that you see a mail car, because by that time, I thought the contracts were over. That's part of the reason 7 and 8 disappeared without that mail contract. But anyway, got a mail car there. And here we are in early 64 at Hornell. You can see the nose ladder, the MU connector, which came late in Erie life. This step on the top of the anticlimber was another part of the things that changed, either just before and certainly on everything after the merger immediately. The bug shield was a late 50s thing, and this guy's got the early lettering, as does this one. Tight lock couplers somewhere appeared. That was not standard equipment, I think, on either set of E8s. And okay, we move to the Jeeps. Again, the Erie Lackawanna Jeeps were same numbers as the Erie. And initially in those years, they were assigned the same way. But the interesting thing about them is that the Lackawanna used a different brake system. That's my 4th bullet point there. They had either 24 or 26 RL brakes, whereas 6BL was the typical brake on all of the Erie road switchers. So unless you're talking about the very last years of the Erie Lackawanna, the Erie road switchers would never operate with Lackawanna road switchers or either company's road units like the F units or the Alco-S. Let's see. The number of different variations of Erie Lackawanna GP7s has been really fascinating, and we'll touch on some of them here as we go through some examples. That's found there in the last bullet point there, MU details, brake or not dynamic brake, winterization hatch, and other things. So here's one of my favorites. The 1228 was the first of the 5 assigned out of Hornell to do the division way freights. And this indeed was at Hornell and very likely preparing to go out on the road. You can see that these guys had a winterization hatch, typical to find a derail or a re-railing frog on both sides. Re-railing frogs are interesting, and if you get into them, they are a matched pair. They're not the same. They have to be used in pairs, and that has to do with the derailed wheel being inside the rails or outside the rails. Here's, I mentioned the LCL traffic required the way freight to stop at the depot. And this is one of those cases when I could photograph the locomotive not moving. And these Erie Jeeps were just loaded with stuff. You have air and signal lines here under the coupler. You have a bunch of MU related hoses up here and MU electrical connections. This mess up here of hoses was part of that 6BL brake system. And here is from the next group higher, slightly newer. It very well demonstrates the 800-gallon fuel tank almost hiding under the locomotive. It's tucked back so far. The dimension from that outer surface to the face of the fuel tank is 24 inches. So it's really hiding back there. The Jeeps, in spite of not needing them on the Allegheny division, they got these automatic train stop pickups here. This guy had a blanked off vent here, and I'm not sure that was typical. This was the first group, 1233 was the first, but this group from then on had horns up top on both sides of the cab. That was a change. And you'll see we got a speed pickup here for the speed recorder back on number 4 axle, but on number 2, you've got another one that drives the speed recorder. The Erie was big on keeping an eye on these guys running too fast, and they had speed recorders to take care of that. I mentioned push poles here. Can't see it very well, but that right there behind the pilot step is a push pole. And we'll see some of them here better shortly. Whoops. Something about my youth, I suffered some kind of malady because I started being curious about these details, like the pickup for the speed recorder and all this plumbing for the air tanks. I wanted to, I suppose I was 16 or 15 years old, I wanted to learn more about that stuff. Here's one of our kind of stripped down models. We saw one of them earlier. No winterization, no dynamic brake, flat handrails there. That's a difference that came with the next group that we just looked at. They had the raised handrails, and push pole is behind the rear step. And I think we go, hello. Hey, I'm talking to you here. Yeah, push pole is at the rear step, but over here, it's at the front step. So for whatever reason, they weren't always in one place or the other. And I think it's divided by the groups. Here's another one of those 4 that were the kind of stripped down model. And again, you can see fuel tank seems to be almost hiding. And even though this is mid 64, they aren't removing these pickups for the automatic train stop. Another detail that you see, the railroad got a little lazy about whether they picked up the snow fence every spring. So they stayed right through the summer where they were placed. Here's from the second group. Hello. From the second group of the Jeep 7s, dynamic brake. These were the only ones that had dynamic brake. They got the flat handrail, older style journals for some reason. Push pole is behind the or ahead of the rear pilot step. And again, automatic train stop pickup is there. These things were just loaded with these little variations that aren't always sensible. Interestingly, the 5 of the Jeep 7s the Erie got for passenger use were intended to fill in as freight locomotives. So they could do everything the freight locomotives did. Of course, they had steam generators, but they could be mixed in with them when demand merited doing it. They got their push pull for their freight work. They've got their re-railing frogs, just as any of the freight locomotives would have. I didn't show it here, but 1405 was a newer unit that came a little later, and it sort of matches the last of the 1200s that were strictly freight. A few other things. We're going to talk about the Elco Fs. When automatic train stop was discontinued, these first generation units moved west of Hornell, and they basically mixed them up all over the railroad. Wherever they needed to run power, they ran power without worrying about assignments. I mentioned earlier that they could not, the Erie road switchers couldn't MU with anything but themselves, but at least they could MU with Baldwins and Elcos. And a long end forward was the front end of the road switchers for both railroads. And I think that covers it here. Matt Hirson took this beautiful photographic Salamanca of the 6-axle Baldwins. This 3-unit set would work up and down the Bradford division, bringing coal from that part of Pennsylvania up to the main line. And This is another view at Salamanca. You can see similar things here. Here they mount the re-railing frogs on either side of the lead truck rather than on the frame. You've got a similar arrangement of a gaggle of hoses here for MU. They got a towing chain in case somebody loses a coupler. And these guys had dynamic brake, which is over here evident behind the cab. And this other side of the locomotive, you see a push pole by the air tank. And here again at Belmont, they've stopped to do LCL work. So I got a picture of this guy sitting there with my mother's Brownie camera. And here I discovered this photograph up in New England at Lowell, where the Boston and Maine has their archives. And this guy is working out of Brockway. He went down south of Dubois to pick up these loaded hoppers at the old Kramer mine, which was on a branch of the Erie off of the original BR&P, later B&O. And this tower is really fascinating because it was actually featured in a very early issue of Trains. You had 4 railroads passing this, trains passing this. It was 2 railroads, but 4 railroads were involved with operations at this tower. Erie had trackage rights. New York Central had trackage rights on the Pensy to the right, and it would swing on to the B&O to the left and follow where the path of the Erie train there. And of course you had B&O trains and you had Pensy trains. Really interesting. I mentioned 617, 618, the 2 S2 Baldwins, they were assigned to Salamanca, but by the time of this photograph, here it's 1964, Salamanca has begun its decline. So there's no longer any switching of boxcars at the freight house or handling of them on trains that would pick them up or set them off. They're passing through town. So they've moved over to Youngstown to help with the steel work there. And on the Bradford division, 2 or 3 of these lower horsepower Baldwins were the assigned locomotives. And here we have a 2-unit Alco set in 1963. This was a 115 car train, and they were struggling this day. They had to stop here to wait for train 1 to go west. And it was quite an interesting evening watching them wait for and then pull out after 1 passed. The PAs, of course, were always a treat to see these things. This is 859, and Paul Tupacheski there believes that this was the first one painted with a 2-tone green. And this is probably shortly after the merger. I don't have the date of this photograph, but again, skirting disappears from these guys because it gets in the way of maintenance, and the nose ladder gets added either with or shortly after the merger. And here we are later in 64 with, I think this is an excursion with how these things operated. Here's a work train at Cuba Junction. It was a 95-degree day, and I was riding my bicycle every place I could go to chase this thing. But they've got 6 gondolas there. They've been unloading ties to rebuild some of the track on the river line. They're getting ready to head west. The caboose there, that C-238, was all that summer ran around without its diamond. It just had the split E. This was another treat when that day that I was there with the track closed and single track between Cuba Junction and Olean. I didn't see these guys at all other than this photograph. I know they passed to and fro often because other people have photographed them on the Allegheny division, but it was a rare thing to see these guys. Here we are with Ned Gayford again at Cuba Junction with, he's handing up a clearance card. And here's his Lackawanna F3, never even got relettered. some of these were in pretty bad shape. I remember seeing along there's a walkway inside on the deck, and the rust of the side panel was very prominent on some of those. You could look in and see somebody's feet. FTs I never saw to remember or make notes of on the Allegheny division. And that was something I had to go to Hornell or east of there to see. But here we are in January '64. These things have not been white lined yet, but they're dead. I should have given my phone to my wife. Sorry for that. Anyway, FTs were again assigned east of Hornell. I think the A unit does not show the automatic train stop, although that might be it there. I think it normally was on the second axle, but anyway, it could have by that time been removed. And I wanted to kind of finish the locomotive story with this guy. We talked about this in one of our earlier Zoom meetings. This ran 5 years on the Erie as a General Electric owned locomotive, but painted as if it was just another one of the Alcos or EMDs, and sort of a kind of a crossbreed between the two. And it was being used to test the Cooper Bessemer diesel engine to evaluate its use for future on General Electric's locomotives. And their intention, although publicly they said otherwise, their intention was to offer in 1960 a 24 or 2500 horsepower locomotive to compete head on, not with Alco, but with General Motors. And I worked this past half year or so with an author that's doing an article for the Locomotive Annual that Trains puts out. It's going to be, I'm told, an 8,500 word story of how the locomotive engine was evaluated and came to be the General Electric engine, which, by the way, is still made right here where I live in Grove City. So I didn't want that to be overlooked. I'll watch for that issue. It's coming out in August. It's the Trains Locomotive Annual. And didn't have a whole lot of direct involvement with the Erie Lackawanna, but it ran on the Allegheny division between Marion and Hornell, and occasionally to Buffalo. And sometimes west of Marion, they were testing it as a 4-unit set and as a chopped up set of individuals that would be evaluated with the competition. And of course, had a very direct influence on the arrival of the U-boats on the Erie Lackawanna. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the rolling stock. And I mentioned earlier about how the 40-foot boxcars disappeared. This could be any part of the rolling stock fleet could be a talk on its own. So I don't want to try and do everything here, but it occurred to me that almost everything I'm showing here was stuff that disappeared with the early years of the railroad, other than some of the passenger equipment. So one of those is the RPO cars. I don't believe any of the Erie RPOs were repainted Erie Lackawanna. Some of them were in bad shape, and the ACF cars suffered rust here at this bottom of the side panels. And the ones they kept were repaired, but I don't think any of the mail cars got that repaired. I think the railroad probably knew the mail days were numbered. Here's one of the famous Erie coaches. I always loved these things, and I got a chance to see this one. I think it was only 4 days out of the Susquehanna shop and had been brought over to Hornell to be put on the train to Buffalo there in 1965. And of course, these 7 Pullman-built similar cars were never modernized. I suspect there was intention to do it, never happened. And the lovely Erie diners. Again, another Matt Herson photograph. That guy really did some nice photography. Thing to see here, you can see the diners had roller bearings where the coaches had solid journal type bearings. Here we are with cabooses. Again, electrified caboose for a radio, but oil lamps. And the radio bay window cabooses were always fascinating. We loved seeing these on the big freights when we could see big freights. Here's one at, I think this is at Susquehanna, and it's now got an Erie Lackawanna label. And the star, people often ask why that star is on these cars. That indicates a toilet's on board. And that's also something you'll see on baggage cars. And Larry DeYoung in one of his books talks about the radio railroad. There's no name on this car. When they got this simplified painting, you know, when this style got simplified to this, it was almost as if they forgot to put a name on there. We'll see this car again, by the way. Here's another Lackawanna caboose on that junker freight we saw earlier, or ordinary. And this probably was part of the reason this train wasn't going very fast. I think it was barely 30 miles an hour. Of course, it had as long as the day is for work, and it had only the 3,000 horsepower up front. The piggyback flats were an interesting creature. These were the 50 that were stretched 10 feet. I always thought, how the heck do you do that and not pull it apart? That's got to be a neat trick to add 10 feet to a 75-foot car. And of course, the Lackawanna had their own answer for piggyback. These have always intrigued me. There were 100 of these auto cars that were built in 42. And by the end of that decade, the railroad realized they really weren't being used or needed for auto service. It would have been likely for parts, although it could. I don't think they were ever equipped with racks. But by late 40s, they reclassed these as XM boxcars rather than XMA. And they also brought out at that time the 6-foot diamond on these cars. So they were rather striking with that diamond and a double door. But after the merger and the loss of LCL and other serious need for 40-foot cars, these and many of the single door cars were sold off. It was in the hundreds. And they went into the aftermarket world, and some ended up on the Great Northern and some on the Northern Pacific and probably some elsewhere. But they were not needed on the Erie Lackawanna. This is another one of them. This guy comes in 1947, and like a lot of its brothers in this 500 car group, you see the note there, LCL service between stations, Erie Railroad. This would normally stay on the railroad for LCL use, but it could have just as well gone off the railroad. Many of them did. And it possessed nothing special for LCL use other than to be available to be loaded at big terminals like we saw at Hornell there. Another intriguing car for me, because the January issue of Model Railroader had an article on scratch building the air slide hopper. And I saw these usually 4 or 5 at a time behind the locomotive eastbound, both at Cuba Junction, and when freight went over the main line, I'd see them in Belmont as a kid. So I always thought these were pretty neat cars. The other thing about I mentioned 3 different operating systems for the division. The railroad had signals that were also different. The old main line used absolute permissive blocks with 3 colors. The river line used CTC with searchlights. Double track west of Cuba Junction to Salamanca was automatic block signal with type G signals, and these were approach lit, whereas the other 2 groups were always on. So if there was a train occupying a block, you'd see a red signal to know. There were fixed signals, and we don't often talk about those, but I'll demonstrate some of those here. Train order signals were rare on the division by my time. And of course, many switch stands and derails stands were topped with oil burning and sometimes later electric lamps. Well, here's that another train there at we saw earlier. This is the way freight, but that signal off to the right is a pair, and the second one is hiding behind the crossbuck. But that's the triangular pattern, 40-inch target for the double track west of Cuba Junction. Here's a little better view of the other signal in that pair. These things date, I think, from possibly the late teens or early 20s. This is the exclusively found on the old main line. This is near Scio. The train has come out of Wellsville, but this would be an intermediate signal between those manually controlled sidings. And here's the same thing at the end of the Andover siding. You can see it's a signal you can stop and proceed at with the number board on it, but the tall signal is the absolute stop signal. And we also see in this view here, kind of blurred, the green indicates you now have a maximum permissible track speed. You've just come off, I think that curve coming down into Andover is a 1.5 or 2 degree curve. So it actually had a 60 instead of 70 mile an hour speed limit on it. By the way, I failed to mention the division in those days had 70 miles an hour allowed for passenger and express trains and 50 for freight. And keep in mind, in those days, 50 was the speed limit on New York State highways. Here we are back at Belmont. Again, the absolute signal there is standing high, and the brakeman is having a dickens of a time throwing that switch back. But we also get illustrated the fixed signal. Here you had to slow from that 70 to 60 with your passenger train because of this curve and 2 more ahead that got the railroad over the Genesee River at Belmont and around the big curve down a mile further down at Belvedere. By the way, this train got past the next crossing before this guy got the switch thrown. He was having a dickens of a time. Here we are on the river line, typical searchlight signal. This again was an intermediate signal pair on the river line. And at Hornell, I didn't have a good picture at HR, a little siding east of Olean, but way down here you see a position light. And that is a telephone train order signal, which was something that Erie did from the late teens, where that signal indication would be controlled by some nearby tower, and it would be used to avoid the need to write train orders and hold up a train while those train orders were being conveyed. It's a very interesting thing, a story that should be told of the Erie Railroad someday. I hope someday we can get that out in print. And train order boards. This guy up here is really more a manual block signal, and that white board right there indicates a place to hang a sheet of metal painted yellow or red, or a lantern that's yellow or red, to indicate train orders to be picked up. And here's another view of that manual signal. Crossing signals in New York State, at least on the Erie, were painted white, and the circuit box that would actuate it on the Erie sometimes looked like that, but sometimes more like the conventional relay box we see on along with signals to handle the relays. And here's typical Erie switch stand, high level, Ramapo design, Dressel oil burning lamp on it. In later years, there was an electric lamp fitted to that stand at Belmont. The other thing you see, this linkage you see right here and here. When you throw that switch stand, that linkage throws a circuit box switch that in effect tells the signal system the block is occupied. So if you open that switch to the siding, you are occupying that block. And that would be part of the reason why you'd have stop and proceed signals on the intermediate signals. If say you had something going on here and that switch was say thrown by an ill-behaved youngster or something else would happen. Maybe a motor car would have been switched in there. Anyway, that was a feature, I believe, that appeared on many, many railroad switches where there was signaling because of that horrible accident that occurred at Wayland on the Lackawanna. Mike Connor has spoken of that in past talks. And the derail, the very poor picture that shows the lamp, but the derail, many of them would have their own lamp. And the neat thing about them was they were yellow lenses and purple lenses. Purple being stop, yellow being proceed. Well, I don't have a caboose, but this scene concludes my talk almost. The high green is at Cuba Junction, and that means that a freight is coming up from Olean and will stay on the old main line and go over the hill. You can see the westbound track has finally received limestone ballast here. And this was a nice evening scene at Cuba Junction in the summertime. It's kind of a steamy evening, as I recall that. But wait, I've been very conscious to not deal with the later Erie Lackawanna. No E-units running on freight trains, no big 6-axle GE or GM units, but I don't want to be totally discriminatory. So this was, I believe, my first picture of an SD45 train in the summer of '67. And they're crossing over to go down the river line here, eastbound at the junction. And there they go. And with that, I conclude. And that, by the way, is that radio railroad caboose we saw earlier. Same one, now dirtier, still carrying a red lantern on the rear. So with that, I'll leave my contact information up and have at the chat there, Paul.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. That was a great presentation. And we do have a number of questions here.
I didn't put everybody to sleep.
No, you got some questions you're going to answer here. First of all, we had a question right off the bat. Can a recording of this be obtained? And we usually put the Zoom meetings up on the Society website like 2 or 3 days afterwards, whenever we have a chance to pull it down, edit, and upload it. So this presentation will be up on the Society's website. If you go to the top of the page, there's a link that says virtual meetings, and you'll see all the virtual meetings that have been done so far. And this is where this presentation can be found. First question we have is from Larry Kirstein. Did those odd boxcars, the Erie 9950, the stock car, still handle automobile traffic? Strange car with so many large openings.
Well, they were old cars when they did that conversion. I think 1934 build date. My impression would be by that time that kind of car would not be useful for modern automotive parts use, and certainly not for shipping inside automobiles. Automobiles were still being shipped, I know, on the early WAG in 1956. I've got some yard reports where several 40-foot boxcars show up to go to Coudersport on the C&PA Railroad, and they would have 4 automobiles potentially inside. But I think by 1960, that probably was a rare thing.
He also asked, did the Auto 100 train terminate in Buffalo?
Are your shows on now? Oh, boy.
Mike, did you hear me?
I heard a lot of garbling.
There's background noise. Another question was, did the Auto 100 train terminate in Buffalo?
No, that train that I showed you there was eastbound on the main line to go somewhere east of Hornell. I don't believe I ever knew, or if I did, I haven't bothered to remember where it went to the east. But I did learn that it came out of Bain, Wisconsin from an old Railroad Model Craftsman article. But surely a lot of traffic came through Buffalo when the auto racks started to appear on the Erie Lackawanna. They were typically coming from Buffalo to Hornell and east. And we didn't see them on the old main line or the Allegheny division. And I think there was a clearance issue. Not sure where or why, but I think if we saw anything at all, it was only a 2-level, not 3-level auto rack. But I don't know where the Ramblers were going. I mean, they could have been going to New England for all we know. But I think it's probably something that can be researched.
Okay. The next question is from Ted. When was the Erie Olean Depot raised? The benches were set on platforms.
Oh, that's kind of, you know, I'm fond of saying my life stops in 1960, but the Olean Depot was, I think, a Conrail victim, but I probably have notes on that somewhere in some of the material Bill Reddy gave me, but other than to say it was in the Conrail timeframe, that's the best I can do.
Okay. Another question from Larry Kirstein. The Carrollton coal train, do you know about how big it ran as far as car count and where did it originate? He's guessing Carrollton was the termination point, and was that a power plant?
No, Carrollton was the junction of the Bradford division or branch, depending on the era, with the main line. Of course, Carrollton is just east of Salamanca. Now, where the coal came from was Brockway. And I showed you the one picture where at DuBois further south, coal is coming up from an Erie served mine there, but that would have been joining other cars at Brockway to go north. And most of the coal at Brockway was delivered by the Pittsburgh and Shawmut. So you'd see a lot of their cars, many of which were former Erie two-pocket offset side cars. You'd see them in those trains that would come out of Brockway. They would, in earlier times, go all the way into Salamanca and then be perhaps repowered to go east through Hornell. However, in later times, they actually reversed the train at Carrollton to go east. They didn't bother going into Salamanca anymore. Again, it was would have been in that time when Salamanca had lost its luster. And the destination of those loads was a power plant somewhere, I think, on the Bloomsburg line. Others in our society know that better than I know. I know Larry DeYoung has mentioned it from time to time. And it's a well-established thing. That coal traffic, by the way, continued well into Conrail era.
So could those have been the coal trains that were heading down to the Portland power plant? Is that what you're thinking of?
I think it is Portland. Again, I haven't tried to remember everything, particularly in my less youthful times, but I think it was Portland.
Okay. A question from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name, Jim Klug or Klug. I've heard that Salamanca was a gondola yard. Any thoughts on this?
I don't recall ever hearing it put quite like that. Two things come to mind. They would have been gathering gondolas there to serve Wellsville and take them up there perhaps as they were needed. The other thing that occurred in the very early Erie Lackawanna era was they had a rail welding facility set up there. And that might have used gondolas to handle the welded rail. But I don't know anything about it being other than those two potential issues. They could have also had loads of ties and riprap, that riprap that I mentioned at the Genesee River washout, that all came in those 52.5-foot gondolas from somewhere. But whether they kept them staged and handy or just got them quickly when they needed them, I don't know. Conceivably, they had gondolas at the ready, though, for general use at Salamanca.
Okay. Another question from Larry. I probably missed you saying this, but was the original Erie route to Chicago northwest out of Cornell, then through River Junction down the river line back to Cuba Junction? And what year was the direct single track route through your hometown completed?
Well, the old main line by way of Wellsville, Belmont, Cuba, Summit, that was 1851. That's the original route of the very first Erie Railroad. The river line, and I showed the cover photo of that 3-part article that Bill Burt did, that was opened in 1910. And Conrail soon terminated its usefulness in 1976, or within a couple of years. I think it hung on briefly, but not long. So the river line was was part of the improvements to the railroad that came with the Moodna Viaduct and the Graham Line and the right-of-way improvements that were like from Jamestown out to Meadville, where you had a second track added that snaked over or under the old line. That all was part of that improvement to the railroad in the first decade of last century.
Okay. A follow-up to that, he asks, also up at River Junction, was there a Y so that a straightaway move could be made from the river line to Buffalo as well as back down towards Hornell?
Yes, there was a Y, and I'm not sure if it was always in service. I mentioned writing that autumn leaf special. We went around that sort of dead leg of the Y to turn west to go towards Silver Spring and ultimately Buffalo. We didn't go to Buffalo, but trains could do that. And in later Erie Lackawanna time, rather than run the RC 297, I think was the freight train that came out of Rochester to go to Buffalo and then down the BNSW to the west, rather than use the BNSW, they would come out of Buffalo, head east as if they were heading to Hornell, get to River Junction, and then go down that leg of that Y onto the river line. It had to be a squealing racket there, because I can just imagine the piggyback cars would have objected to what would have been, I'm sure, a fairly sharp curve on that Y. But yeah, that Y was there and in use relatively late in life of the railroad.
Okay. And the last question is more of a comment regarding that Erie 9950 from Owen Thorne. The conversion turned those older auto cars into stock cars. PRR and New York Central had similar converted cars for stock. X-Boxer 950 was now a stock car in that photo. That's more of an observation than a question.
Yeah, it wasn't unusual to convert those older cars, and certainly Erie didn't have a lock on it. What struck me was that it came so close to the merger. Those 25 cars were probably completed before October of 1960. And they end up going to the Pennsy of all places. We don't think of as being a stock handling railroad. At least I don't, not in my time.
They didn't last that long on the EL either, because they were fairly new rebuilds. I mean,
Yeah.
literally right before the EL. And
The stock traffic I remember that would have been after the departure of those cars was with Mather cars that had been stretched. Some of you may know that was a thing that was done. And in fact, Stan Roderowitz, in his kind of custom casting of resin parts, he had a way to take two of the 40-foot Mather stock cars and cut them apart and stretch them out to model those later cars. And those show up late in the 60s. I got a photograph of a NENY 74 at Belmont with one of them right behind the locomotive. And then there's a story about how they got held up, so they had to get them out of the car and give them the mandatory rest and watering and food. And they did that at Binghamton. And I think it's Chuck Younger talks about those cattle getting loose. They didn't have any pens anymore. And they had to make up some makeshift sort of a corral to put them in, and it didn't hold them. So they were chasing beef cattle around downtown Binghamton, I guess. Funny things happen. Oh, I might also add that Joe Laughlin was working on a model of that 50-foot stock car and the boxcar it was made from when he passed on. So sadly, we never got to see that, but it was something he was working on.
no, you still may, because the new JJA models under the Costello brothers are going to resurrect a lot of the work Joe is doing. So hopefully we'll see that.
Yeah, I hope that comes to be. Joe had some nice work, and it was nice to see that continue.
So that looks like the last of the questions. There's some kudos, which you can, oh wait, there's one more question here. Did passenger trains ever use the River Line either as scheduled or detour?
Yes,
Logan G.
Yes to both questions. Absolutely so. Like when that Genesee River was trying to destroy the work of 1851 there at Belmont, all the regular traffic detoured over the River Line. That was not unusual at all. And the only other passenger train traffic you'd see there would have been the excursions, like I described. There were no station stops on the River Line, and there were no customers ever on the River Line. That was strictly for, you'd call it an airline in the old days. It was for getting trains quickly from here to there, and without the grades of the old main line. There was a very comfortable 33, 32 miles of railroad with no serious grades. However, they did have those two large bridges and some curves that required the freights to slow down.
Okay, another question came in. Did the majority of the high-profile UPS trailer trains, especially toward the twilight years of the EL, run by the River Line as a rule?
My understanding of once the passenger traffic either was very diminished or gone, the River Line and the Old Main Line were considered respectively a westbound and an eastbound railroad. So anything heading east, as long as there was sufficient power, would go over the Old Main Line, and the westbounds would go the River Line. Now, obviously, there would have been exceptions, but that was the general way it was done, and it was done because you no longer had to weave in and out of passenger trains going through. By the way, if there are questions, I welcome phone calls, regular old USPS mail, or internet mail. Anybody wants to pursue any of these points further.
That's the last of the questions in the chat. There's a couple kudos there. You can take a look at your own time, Mike, but I think that concludes the meeting for today. We're going to leave the bridge open for a bit so people can still chat if they'd like to with the other members. But otherwise, thank you all for attending. We're going to try to have we're going to try to have a meeting in July. We're trying to line up a presenter, but with the summer months, that might be tricky with vacations and such. But stay tuned. An email blast will be going out one way or the other if we're going to do something in July. And I think we are. We have 2 people as possible presenters. Hopefully we'll be able to send something out in the not too distant future. Thanks everyone for attending and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care all.